monthly year.
Welcome, one and all, and happy Halloween. I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz, and you're listening to HallowBirthday number 9.
That's right, 9 years ago today, we put out the very first ever Knock Once for Yes, and who could have guessed that it would grow into what it has, or that we would still be sharing spooky stories with you all nearly a decade later.
We hope that you've all been enjoying our spooky season shorts Halloween countdown. It's something that we've wanted to do since we started the show, and after 9 years, we finally got around to it. But today is not a mini episode, it's a full-blown, good old-fashioned HallowBirthday bonanza. We've got stories, we've got a paranormal postcard, and of course we have our seasonal favourite, tenuous Halloween news stories. Let's see who found the most outrageously vague link this year.
But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say a huge thank you to our latest patrons. And this comes with a little bit of an apology. Normally, we're quite good at contacting people and asking how to pronounce their names if we're not sure. And this time, we just completely dropped the ball. We've been so busy doing the spooky season shorts. We did a fail. So we really apologise if we pronounce anybody's name incorrectly. And if we butcher it, please let us know. Tell us how to pronounce it correctly, and we'll give you another shout out next episode to try and make up for it. So without further ado, thank you so much to
Bochler,
Christina Wirad-Marja,
Paul Renier,
Ellie,
E.T.,
Christy Martell,
Jessica McIntosh,
and Susie Drailsma.
And thank you to CLK and KTP for upping their pledges.
Thank you so much to all of our incredible patrons and supporters. You are the reason we're still here, bringing you all the ghosty goodness we can muster. And we adore our wonderful, kind, enthusiastic, fun Patreon community. You all have such a special place in our hearts. And that goes for everyone who has ever supported the show over this nearly a decade. I can't believe we're still here doing this in 2025. And that is all down to you, our amazing supporters. But now, let's get stuck into the thing we look forward to curating for you all year long. It's time for the tenuous Halloween news story battle. So, not long after we began the show, we introduced a segment called The Paranormal Radar, in which we shared interesting spooky stories that had recently made the news. However, we noticed that around Halloween, every news outlet and their aunt tried to hop on the spooky bandwagon, sharing paranormally themed news stories, whether there was any actual news to share or not. The result was some hilariously non-spooky stories with barely a whiff of an actual ghost or legend, and it soon turned into a friendly competition between Fitz and myself to see who could find the most tenuous, ludicrous, or hilarious news story amongst them. So, let's find out who is going to win the most tenuous link contest this year. Do you want to go first, Fitz? Because I believe you've got something of a Halloween-y top 10.
I do. Well, it's not actually a top 10, it's a top 13, but we'll get to that.
Are you going to do it top of the pop style?
Well, I'll give it a go, but I'm not sure it will necessarily work for this one. My article comes courtesy of the Great Outdoors magazine, and it's entitled Britain's Most Spooky Walks for Halloween Season. This was not entirely tenuous, to be honest. It's more of a roller coaster of hits and flops. But we do have a good top 10 or top 13 on the Paranormal Radar. In this case, the subtitle reads, History buffs and storytellers know our sometimes horrifying human history can haunt our hills. Here are 13 historically and mythologically inspired spooky walks. It then goes on to provide a list of the locations that will be featured in the article, except they only list 12 rather than 13, so not the best start. And I do also need to say that there are a lot of Scottish and Welsh place names in this article, and I've done my best to find out how to pronounce them properly. In fact, it was the longest part of my research.
But as always, if we do butcher them, please get in touch and tell us how to pronounce them properly. And if you can do a recording, even better. We actually were talking the other day about maybe we need to create like a data bank of how to pronounce folkloric names that are quite difficult to find sometimes.
That would be really useful. I definitely think we should do that.
Mm-hmm.
But getting back to our list, and all of which were selected purely by editor's choice, by the way, is Ben Macdhu in the Cairngorms, the second highest mountain in Scotland and a demanding walk from the sounds of things. The route they mention is 20 miles long, climbs 3,300 feet, and is expected to take 9.5 hours. Not for the faint-hearted, but a strong start, as there are a couple of unnatural encounters that they suggest you should be on the lookout for on the way. The first is, and actually before I pronounce these, there were a couple of different pronunciations I found from different Scottish people. So the first was Bodach Lav Gerach, or Bodach Lav Gerig, or the Spectre of the Bloody Hand, not to be confused with Lav Yarach, which is a different Irish legend. Bodach Lav Gerig isn't typically encountered on Ben Macdhu. He's normally found a few miles away on the eastern shore of Loch Morlich. But even so, it's an interesting tale. He appears as the figure of a huge old man with a bloody hand, and despite his apparent age, gives off the aura of a warrior. He challenges those he encounters to combat, but if you do ever encounter him, you should choose your response wisely. Those who accept his offer are spared and allowed to pass, but those who refuse will suffer from bad luck, or possibly even death, depending on which version of the story you believe. I also found a reference to him being a kind of guardian spirit who punishes people who overhunt the land around him. Sadly, I struggled to find much in the way of references, and so I'd love it if anyone more knowledgeable could point me in the right direction to find out a little more about this interesting piece of folklore. I found a lot more information on the second entity that you might encounter at Ben Macdhu though, and it's one of the more famous apparitions in Scotland. I am, of course, talking about the Big Grey Man of Macdhu, or Amphir Mór. Said to haunt the summit and passes of Ben Macdhu, Amphir Mór is more often heard than seen, with the sounds of crunching footsteps doggedly trailing walkers on the mountain. Often accompanying these footsteps is a feeling of dread, as well as being watched. Some have seen it though, as the name Big Grey Man would attest, and if anything, big is an understatement, as he's reportedly 10 feet tall. He is broad-shouldered and long-armed, but thin, and has both dark skin and hair. Despite his size, he frequently manages to shroud himself in the mists that often cloak the mountain as he stalks unwary travellers. One of the explanations often given to account for sightings of Amphir Mór are Brocken spectres, which sound like an interesting supernatural entity themselves, but are in fact an illusion that occurs in foggy conditions where a person's shadow is cast onto fog, and which often appear to be incredibly large and standing in thin air. It's often revealed to be an illusion when onlookers discover that these giant spectres mirror their own movements and actions. I have no doubt that more than one sighting of Amphir Mór can be attributed to this phenomenon. However, it still doesn't really explain the sound of footsteps, or the permeating feeling of unease. Perhaps even less so the encounter of naturalist and mountaineer Alexander Tunian in 1943, which he recounted in an article in the Scots magazine in 1958. I spent a 10-day leave climbing alone in the Cairngorms. One afternoon, just as I reached the summit cairn of Ben Macdhu, mist swirled across the Larrig Grú and enveloped the mountain. The atmosphere became dark and oppressive. A fierce, bitter wind whisked among the boulders, and an odd sound echoed through the mist. A loud footstep, it seemed. Then another and another. A strange shape loomed up, receded, came charging at me. Without hesitation, I whipped out the revolver and fired 3 times at the figure. When it still came on, I turned and haired down the path, reaching Glenderry in a time that I have never bettered. You may ask, was it really the Fearlith Moor? Frankly, I think it was. So far, not too bad, but unfortunately the author was apparently not as invested in number 2, Hadrian's Wall, as the entry for this amounted to, "The Romans built a wall, you can walk along it." This is actually quite a famously haunted location, so it is a shame they didn't mention any of the ghost stories, like the ghost of Mile Castle 42, where an apparition in Roman armour is frequently seen standing watch at the top of the 16-foot wall, even though the wall no longer reaches much more than head height. He is so commonly seen that he has been gifted a name and a backstory by common folklore. Lucius was said to have fallen in love with a local Briton, only to discover that she was simply using him in order to aid her in smuggling goods across the wall. When the smuggling operation was discovered and Lucius implicated, in shame, he ended his life, but not, it seems, his watch, as he had stood guard over the border for nearly 2,000 years. How true this story is, I will leave to your imagination, but it is far from the only sighting of Roman soldiers along the remains of the wall. I'll have to start being about as brief with my summaries as the great outdoors are, as we still have quite a few locations left to get through. So, without further ado, number 3 is Pendle Hill in Lancashire, and the summary here is basically, you've all heard of the Pendle Witches, right? And if you haven't, then don't rely on the great outdoors to inform you. Number 4 is the Corpse Road in the Lake District, and as the name implies, people use this road to take the bodies of their loved ones to church to be buried. I'll give this one a pass for giving that slightly spooky fact. But there are some really interesting stories about corpse roads that they passed over, and we may have to dig into them ourselves in future. I got my hopes up for number 5, which is Urwitha, previously anglicised to Mount Snowdon. The article calls it the final resting place of Ritagaur, the strongest and most violent of all the giants. Although rather than expanding on this nugget of folklore, the scariest thing the great outdoors found to say about the route was that sometimes it gets a bit busy. Credit where credit's due, they put a little more effort into the next 2 entries, both in, and I apologise, I cannot roll my R's, I'm trying, in Eruri.
Oh, you did it!
Did I do it?
You did it! You rolled your R!
I've been practising this for hours.
And not a single rolled R came out until the crucial moment. Eruri.
Apparently I work best under stress.
You do.
Anyway, the first of the 2 is the Roman steps at Rheinogvawr, where local legend tells of a group of Roman soldiers that can be seen climbing the steps. And in the second, we're told of a legend involving a large stone outside Mainturog Church that was said to have been thrown from the top of Moelwyn Mawr, either by a giant in order to attack the villagers, or by St. Turog in a fight against the devil. I'll give them a couple of spooky points for number 8 as well, which sees us heading off to the Peak District to discover the story of a plane crash that occurred on Higher Shelf Moor near Bleaklow in 1948. The wreckage of the USAF B-29 Superfortress remains there to this day, serving as a chilling memorial. What they don't mention, however, is that phantom plane crashes are frequently seen in the area. There are multiple reports of people living nearby or driving through the area seeing World War II-era aircraft flying too low and apparently in trouble, crashing into the ground and exploding into flames. Rushing to help, they find absolutely nothing once they get there. For the next stops of Woldsgrove Hill and Devil's Den in Worcestershire, though, inspiration definitely seems to be waning, and we're simply encouraged to imagine haunted happenings and beware of, wait for it, the deer. Big, huge deer with nasty, big, pointy teeth, you may ask? Nope. Muntjacs. Pretty much the very smallest deer the UK have to offer. Terrifying. The next entry gets some points for sharing the story of Llynefan-Fach, a small lake in the Banau Brycheiniog. Here it is said that a mystical lady emerged from the waters of the lake and married a local, vowing that their marriage should last until he should strike her 3 causeless blows. Sadly, he eventually did, and she promptly returned to the lake, never to be seen again. The next location, Amynydd Dwan, isn't given any spooky accolades at all, apart from its proximity to the famously haunted Skirrid Inn. One place that does have plenty of paranormal occurrences, though, is the location of the last 2 walks. The first is Devil's Tour to Wistman's Woods, both locations ripe with folklore and legend, but for some reason the article doesn't address either of these, instead focusing on the strange Dartmoor apparition of the hairy hands, which you might encounter on the road driving home. Well, at least they mentioned an actual legend, I guess. And then we finish up with another bit of a damp squib. Still on Dartmoor, but this time it's Bleak House, where there is, wait for it, an old abandoned house. Apparently that is spooky enough for the magazine to end their article right there, which is a shame, as there definitely are legends and tales surrounding Bleak House, but you won't find them in this article. So, a bit of a mixed bag, but at least they did publish the article in August, giving us plenty of time to do our own research into the actual ghost stories of the walks mentioned. And each entry comes with a link to a full route description, so it's a good start for planning your walk. But of course, we would always recommend that you also take a reliable map, preferably OS, if Lil has anything to say about it.
Not sponsored, but should be.
And probably a compass as well.
So the thing is, you took what was quite a limp article and you did a me and went down a rabbit hole and made it really genuinely interesting.
Oh, well, I tried.
So do you get a point? Can you have a point for does it count anymore as a tenuous link? Because you generally, like, I was sitting here getting really invested in this in this walk, in these routes. And sometimes I wish that we did video and not just audio only, because in my head, as I was sitting here listening, getting more and more invested, this kind of just turned into a sketch where Fitz is in front of the microphone being slightly sarcastic about these routes. And I'm in the background, first of all, listening, getting invested. And then I get my OS maps out and you just see me in the background unfolding maps all over the table. And then I'm getting more and more into it. And I'm getting the hiking packs out and the walking boots. And I'm just packing stuff for a picnic. And by the end of it, I'm ready to go, because now I actually want to go on all these trips.
There's definitely a few on here that are quite interesting, and a lot of them that I'm like, I really want to visit them because there is so much spooky stuff going on. I was just kind of disappointed that they barely mentioned any of it.
Yeah, especially the beware of the deer.
Yes. Yes. Can you possibly beat the terrifying tales of a busy footpath or muntjac deer?
The terrifying muntjac with nasty big pointy teeth. Well, I think we may have both failed at our own game this year, because unfortunately my first tenuous Halloween story is not actually that tenuous either. It's actually quite interesting. So if you're a fan of the long-running TV series Downton Abbey, you will no doubt be aware that a new film has come out quite recently. The TV series and movies were all filmed at a real Grade 1 listed country house in Hampshire, England, set in a 5,000-acre parkland estate designed by the famous 18th century landscape architect Capability Brown.
And I've just got to nip in and say, I love that name, Capability Brown. That's just, it stirs something in my British soul.
It does. It makes me just want to hop on a horse and ride off into the sunset or something. And also, it does also always bring to mind a particular kind of landscape, a parkland landscape, because I think we've got quite a lot of parkland estates that were designed by Capability Brown in Britain. And I think I spent quite a lot of time being dragged around them as a child. But the Highclere Castle we're used to seeing on our screens as the grand home of the fictional Crawley family was built in 1679, with major renovations in the 1840s. But the first written records of the estate date back to the year 749, when an Anglo-Saxon king granted the land to the bishops of Winchester, and there is an even earlier Iron Age hill fort within the grounds. So it's little wonder that the real-life Downton has a few ghosts about the place. Nowadays, it's the home of the Carnarvon family, and yes, that is the same family as the Earl of Carnarvon, who was supposedly cursed by his excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb. They even have an Egyptian exhibition on site. And it just so happens that Lady Fiona, the 8th Countess of Carnarvon, has just put out a new book called A Year at Highclere, Secrets and Stories from the Real Downton Abbey, on which Highclere's resident ghosts reportedly get a whole chapter of their own. Lady Fiona admits to having seen the odd ghost around the 300-odd rooms, and even reports calling in a rector to ask one in particular to calm down a bit. It's so British. More of that later, actually. This sounds quite tame, though, compared to one of her predecessors who apparently had to bring in no less than 6 bishops to get one of the estate's more unruly ghosts under control. So is this jumping on the bandwagon? Well, I suppose it depends if you think just having one chapter on the castle's ghosts is stretching the seasonal relevance a bit. I may be a bit biased personally, though, because I am in fact a bit of a Downton fan. So I'm quite interested and may pick up the book myself at some point. So I'll probably go ahead and rate myself a low 2 on the tenuous link leaderboard for that one. But to be honest, I thought some of you might be genuinely interested, so I had to share. I'll pop the link for the book in the show notes. I do have a slightly more tenuous one up next, though. And this is Ipswich Museum's Halloween video short. Now, if you're in our Facebook group, you may remember that last year, Ipswich Museum's Facebook page absolutely won Halloween with their haunted doll battle that put the museum's creepiest antique dolls head-to-head in rounds of face-offs all the way up to Halloween. It was some epic nightmare fuel. So as you can imagine, we were expecting something gloriously creepy as a follow-up. But it didn't quite deliver. The video starts off talking about Christchurch Mansion, where the museum is housed, telling us that the mansion was built on the site of the medieval Holy Trinity Priory. Definitely some potential for ghosts there, one would think. We're told that in 1393, Canon John Bendel received a royal pardon for causing the death of the priory's cook. Possible murder and intrigue. I wonder where this is going. Tension building now. Our host is surely about to reveal the spooky connection, and they inform us that 200 years later, contemporary accounts reported that food at the priory was bad and that the cook was dirty. Our intrepid hosts ask us, is there a spooky connection? No. Ipswich Museums. What? I'm not convinced there is anything spooky about a dirty cook preparing bad food 200 years after a different cook died. What did you think the connection would be? I had high hopes for this. Ipswich Museum, I feel let down.
We
love
were
you,
both
but,
really confused
guys,
by this one.
What?
Yeah, I think we both sort of watched it and thought, did they miss a bit?
I'm still not convinced that hasn't happened, but
Yeah.
I've looked everywhere, and if anybody can find what the spooky connection actually is, please let me know, because I would love to find out. And if anybody from Ipswich Museums does happen across this, please take it in good humour. We love and value all our museums, but no one is safe from the tenuous Halloween news story contest. So you just have to up your game next year, okay?
Yeah, last year you nailed it.
You nailed
Those
it. You
dolls
won
were creepy.
Halloween. And if anyone is out Ipswich way, do pop by the Christchurch Mansion Museum. They've got some amazing collections showing the history of the house from the 16th to the 19th century, including a Victorian wing displaying a collection of antique toys and the aforementioned terrifying dolls. And if you do go, please take some photos for the Facebook group of the dolls with their cold, uncanny, staring eyes, just to give me some lovely nightmares. Well, my last one is unfortunately not even from this year, but I had to include it because it was just so tenuous. I think the BBC reporter tasked with finding a suitably spooky news story on the 30th of October 2023 was feeling rather uninspired when they chose to report on a knitted postbox topper in Warwickshire. Now, I don't know if this is a thing in other countries, but here in England, pretty much every town has a handful of those classic red postboxes. And in recent years, many towns have enjoyed something called yarn bombing. This is a lot gentler and more artistic than it might sound. But basically, nifty local knitters get super creative, crafting seasonal displays featuring nature themes, all kinds of creatures, characters, and even celebrities out of wool that sit on the post boxes like little decorative woolly hats. It's not just limited to post boxes. Yarn bombers have been known to decorate all sorts of other objects around town, such as benches and bollards, and we've actually got some incredibly talented and staggeringly prolific yarn bombers in our hometown. But what was so newsworthy about Warwickshire's display on that late October day of 2023? Was it an extraordinarily spooky extravaganza of knitted terrors? Well, no, it really wasn't. It was actually woolly models of King Charles and Queen Camilla that had been knitted for the King's coronation earlier that year, except the knitters had recycled the figurines into Dracula and his bride. The finished topper featuring an ashen-faced Charles who honestly just looked a bit ill but with added fangs, and a not especially spooky-looking Camilla stirring a bubbling cauldron. I think maybe the BBC were having a bit of a slow news day that Halloween. Still, being very eco-minded, I'm sure that Charles would very much approve of the upcycling ethics employed by the yarn bombers. I'll have to put a link in the Facebook group to the article so you guys can see the photos, because they're just... Yeah, you really have to see it.
They are something.
They're something. Also, I'll try and remember to pop round town and see if I can get any pictures of our postbox toppers from our yarn bombers.
Yeah, they're really, really good. And there's one that was in our local Facebook group.
We need to go. We're planning a trip to go and see it. It's not the nearest postbox to us, but they've actually knitted an alien abduction postbox topper.
Yeah.
It's literally a cow being sucked off the face of the earth by a spaceship, and it lights up at night time.
Yeah, so we've got to go out, basically, because they take them in at night.
So
we've got to go out after dark, but not too late so that they've taken it in. So we're going to have to do a stealth raid to get some pictures of it for you.
We're going to have to do a stealth drive-by to snap some pictures of the alien abduction postbox topper before it gets tucked away for bed at 7 p.m. Well, that's all the tenuous Halloween stories I found this year. They were a little thin on the ground. But what do you think, guys? Who do you think won the most tenuous Halloween story contest? And if any of you find a wonderfully non-spooky jumping on the bandwagon, not really at all Halloween related, but trying to be story, do send it to us. We'd love to see them. Well, I think it's about time for some stories. So let's get into our first story of the episode. And this one is from Kris.
This happened over 20 years ago. I used to live in Nottingham, and with a comprehensive school-age son, I had to travel to another area to buy his uniform from the only shop that sold it. My friend decided to come along with me as there was an outdoor market there too. We all got on the bus and went upstairs. You know when you live in the city and some people have an energy and you just don't want to look their way because it could lead to trouble? Well, at the top of the stairs, I felt that way about the person at the back of the bus, so I went straight to the front seats. Afterwards, I found out that we had all three felt that way. So myself and my friend were on the left front seat, and my son was on the right. We were chatting away, and I could feel that the lad had come and sat behind us, and it felt like he was moving his head behind our shoulders to listen in. I felt annoyed at having our space invaded, and I continued to ignore the lad, who had then put his feet in the back of my seat and was pushing the back of it forward. I was getting really annoyed, and my friend and I were making faces at each other like, what is their problem? I expected trouble. I had 3 young boys at that time, so I wasn't going to give in to being annoyed to get attention. Just as I thought this, the back of the seat was pushed so hard it moved forward a few inches. That was it. Mum mode was triggered. I looked around fast, ready to ask what was their problem. There was no one there. The whole upper deck was empty. Straight away, my son said that he saw the seat move, and my friend obviously felt it, and felt the same about him trying to listen in. We were spooked, but excited. We were about to get off anyway, and got up to leave. As we looked back, there was a perfect impression of a bum in the leather seat behind where I'd been sitting. I wish I'd taken the bus ID number. It would be interesting to know if others have experienced anything on a bus to Arnold.
And thank you so much to Kris for sharing that story. Oh, I remember that feeling so well. I used to spend quite a lot of time on my younger years on buses, often late at night coming home from work when there were few people around and it was dark. And I can remember that feeling sitting here right now of knowing there was somebody on that bus behind me with just that vibe. You knew there were trouble. You knew that you absolutely just did not want to make eye contact with them. And I remember just frantically staring ahead, trying to just keep myself to myself, make myself small and just not be noticed. It's actually a really horrible feeling.
Yeah, were you the magnet like me?
Yes, I was.
Yeah.
If I was sitting on a bus, I would find the quietest corner. I would tuck myself up away from everybody else. I would put my nose in a book to make it quite clear that I was unavailable. And every single time somebody would just come right up and sit next to me and start telling me their life story.
Yeah. And not even necessarily something horrible, but just the person that wanted to talk. Yeah. And I was exactly the same. I would always have a book or something. Mm-hmm. I would definitely be giving off leave me alone vibes.
I just want to listen to my music. I'd often have headphones on as well. Yeah. I'd be listening to music. And like you say, that wasn't always a negative experience. It's just that whoever was on that bus that wanted a conversation, they always made a beeline for me.
Yeah, same. I was the magnet. But this was a really interesting story. I want to know if anyone else has had a similar experience on that bus, because this was kind of creepy. Like, I can imagine if one person had thought they'd seen something or had a vibe, you can kind of think, well, you know, maybe it was just a noise of the bus. But the fact
not when they're actually like pushing in the back of the seat with their feet.
All 3 of them had the same experience. They could feel and see the seat move. And then when they got up and there was the imprint of the person left in the seat. Yeah. And I'm sure, you know, those things dissipate quite quickly.
They do. So they'd have had to get up so quickly. I don't see how they could have got down the stairs, especially not without being heard. Because it sounds like the bus was still moving. And if you've ever tried to walk around on a moving double-decker bus, you just end up kind of ping-ponging off the walls as you're trying to get down the stairway, don't you? So it's not quiet.
And this was, you know, disappearing in the time it takes someone to turn their head. You know, they felt the chair being pushed and they turned immediately round to ask them, what are they doing? And there was nobody there.
It's the kind of experience that I always sort of expected to have on the late-night buses I was on. I was always kind of half expecting something like that to happen. So it's actually, in a way, kind of cool to hear that it has happened, but I'm sure it wasn't cool in the moment. So sorry, Kris.
So thank you again, Kris, for that story. And if anyone has had a similar experience on the bus to Arnold, let us know, because we would love to hear about it.
I love stories about phantom passengers. If anybody else has any phantom passenger stories, I'm really fascinated by them. Please do let us know.
They are so good. But it is now time for our next listener story, and this one is from Abbie.
So this is really my mum's story. I was a little busy being a brand new human. I was born at Burnley General Hospital, Lancashire in December of 1990. I was my mum's first child, so after giving birth she spent a couple of nights in the hospital. She was obviously tired, but so happy to finally have her little baby girl. Unfortunately, I was one of those fussy kids that didn't want to be breastfed. My mum was really struggling. She was a first-time mum and all she wanted was to be a good mum. She tried everything to soothe me and get me to feed, but I was having none of it. After a while, she started to get upset and couldn't understand what she was doing wrong. As she sat with me in her arms, a little old nurse came onto the ward. She says she remembers this woman vividly because as she looked at her, she noticed she was wearing an old nurse's uniform, the ones that came with a short cape over the shoulders and a little white hat. She was an older lady with grey curly hair, so Mum just assumed she was the matron. The nurse approached her bedside and asked how she was getting on. My mum burst into tears and started sobbing. She told the nurse how she couldn't get me to feed and that she must be doing something wrong. The nurse comforted her and assured her she wasn't doing anything wrong. Some babies just take a little longer to latch. There's nothing wrong with using a bottle, and that none of that made her a bad mum. As my mum sobbed and thanked her, the nurse talked her through using a bottle and how to feed little baby me. My mum settled down and got me feeding. The nurse reassured her one last time, then said she would come back later to check on her. An hour or so went by and my mum had settled in, fed me and put me to bed. As she was resting, another nurse came onto the ward. She checked in and asked my mum how she was doing and if she needed anything. My mum replied, "No, I'm fine now, thanks. The other nurse came in a while ago and sorted me out with a bottle." The nurse looked confused and asked which nurse had come in. My mum said, "I don't know her name, but she's the little old woman with grey hair, wearing a cape." The nurse looked at my mum and said, "There's only me and one other nurse on the ward tonight, and neither of us are that old. We don't wear capes anymore either." Apparently, having a baby gives you other things to think about, so my mum just responded, "Oh, okay." She never mentioned it to anyone again, not even my dad. Years later, she just happened to tell me that I saw a ghost once, but I just had a baby, so I didn't really care. If there is a little old nurse ghost wandering around Burnley General Hospital, I'm glad she's still there looking after people.
And thank you to Abbie for sharing that story. I really like that one. And there was the bit that got me was the cape. It was because if it was just somebody that looked like a regular nurse, you could think, oh, well, maybe it was a passing nurse from another department or something like that. But it was one of those, like, we haven't used that uniform in 25 years.
Yeah, by the 1990s, capes and the little white hat were very long out of date, I think, weren't they?
I know they were in use in the 70s. I don't know when they were phased out. But yeah, that was the moment. That was did he look like the person in this photograph? It was that
the
moment.
Penny dropped.
Yeah, I love those stories. And it was such an awesome feel-good story as well. I do try and bring this up every time something like this happens, but spooky paranormal stuff doesn't have to be scary.
No, and this story was very much the opposite of that. For that little old nurse to appear in a moment of genuine need at such a vulnerable time, I think that's incredible. What a lovely ghost story for Halloween. So thank you again to Abbie for sharing that amazing story. And that brings us to our last story for this episode, and this one is from Harper.
The year before last, I went to visit my grandma. I always go to visit when I'm in my hometown, since I live 2 hours away and don't get to see her as often. As always when I visit, we got to talking about paranormal things, and she told me this. She woke up one morning, went to the toilet that's next to her bedroom on the ground floor as usual, and every morning is the same. Toilet and then a reviving cup of coffee. To get to the kitchen, she needs to climb the stairs, and on the bottom of the stairs, she'd placed a little furry mat. She went to the stairs and stepped onto the mat, and the mat was soaking wet. Absolutely soaking, like someone had dunked it in a tub and then just slapped it back down. Mind you, my grandma just turned 74 when this happened, and she realises that she might be getting on in years. But this? So she did what anyone would do in this situation and smelled it, to see if someone had had an accident on it. But nope, no untoward smells there. She looked to the ceiling. No leaks, and there isn't anywhere it could leak from either. Just to be sure, she called my aunt that lives down the street and got her to check. She couldn't find anything out of the ordinary either. They even called a plumber out on emergency call to check, since there was so much water. But the only thing that had any water on it was the mat. No leaks, no condensation, no accidents. We've been talking about this every time I see her or we talk on the phone, and neither her, my aunt, or I have any ideas of what it was. What do you think? Have you heard about anything like this before? Do you think it's some kind of manifestation or something? I had a theory about it being linked to me, as my grandma and I have a very close bond, and this occurred just when I started outdoor swimming. So I had a thought that maybe it could be some sort of warning for me to be careful. That's the closest thing I could come to any sort of explanation. I have, since the soaking of the mat incident, been very careful when in water, so maybe it was. Who knows? Either way, it gives me so much to think about.
Thank you so much to Harper for sending that in. And as to what we think it might be, this is an odd one, but I will say that there definitely have been paranormal cases where there have been spontaneous puddles, pools of water appearing, mats being soaked. And it's going to sound a bit silly, but the reason I wanted to include this story in the Halloween episode was because what you've described happening to this mat literally happens in the BBC mockumentary Ghostwatch. Now, any long-time listener of the show will know that we quite famously watch Ghostwatch every single year on Halloween. It is our Halloween tradition. We are a bit mad about it. You've probably all heard the Ghostwatch special that we did with Stephen Volk, the writer. And it's a real nostalgia trip for us because it was something that came out during our childhood and really sparked my interest in the paranormal in many ways. Now, that was fiction, but the thing is that all of that fictional story was really, really heavily based on the real Enfield poltergeist. And I did have a quick look, and it does seem like the puddles of water. In Ghostwatch, what happens is they literally go into the living room and find a pool of water in the rug. And it's just spontaneous. They do exactly the same thing as your grandma did. You know, they check around, they give it a sniff, they check the ceiling, they stand on a table and, you know, feel around for damp patches. There's nothing coming through. This pool of water has just manifested in the rug. So you can see why that scene from Ghostwatch just instantly jumped to mind when I read this story. But like I said, despite that being a fictional televised broadcast, it was based on mainly the Enfield haunting, but apparently like lots of other poltergeist hauntings. The writers drew inspiration from all sorts of poltergeist cases, and there are many that have involved spontaneous manifestations of water in one form or another. There have even been cases of people finding damp footprints going through their house. In fact, I think we had a story from somebody who found damp footprints quite early on in our episodes.
I think we did. There was also, I'm sure everyone knows we're fans of Greg and Dana Newkirk in the
Unbinding.
The Unbinding. They had that in their house as well.
Yeah. There was one case I remember reading about quite a long time ago. It wasn't another poltergeist case, but it actually started raining in the house. And I believe in that, I can't remember what the case was, annoyingly. I'll try and look it up. But in that case, the family actually called a policeman around because they just didn't know what else to do.
What?
So
yeah, what do you do? If it starts raining inside your house, what do you do?
Exactly, right? And so we don't only have the eyewitness of the word of the family, We also have like an officer of the law who came in and saw this happening. I'll really have to try and remember what that case
I'm
was,
gonna have
because
to look into that
it was
myself.
fascinating. So obviously I don't want to scare you by coming out with all these poltergeist cases. I'm not sure that it's the same thing, because
it
in
sounds
poltergeist
like it only
case,
happened once here.
yeah, exactly. Like most poltergeist cases, it's like a recurring experience, isn't it? These things are happening over and over again. And this is just like one odd, spontaneous thing. But yeah, I have no explanation for it, but it definitely is something that happens in paranormal cases that we've heard about. I do need to look more into whether it was something specifically that happened in the Enfield case, though, because I found a couple of reports that said it did, but I couldn't find any really in-depth information about how this water manifested in pools or when it occurred. But I've been longing to do a bit of a deep dive into the Enfield for a while now. And we're actually intending, on Halloween weekend, we were trying to think of something fun to do that was low energy, because we've been really, really busy recently. We wanted to do something spooky that just involved basically being in our pajamas. So we're going to have an Enfield marathon, because there are so many documentaries out there now, and it is a subject I really want to do a bit of a deep dive in. So if anybody else wants to do an Enfield marathon over Halloween weekend, we're going to be watching... There was a BBC Nationwide special in the 70s that I'm sure is still on YouTube, so I want to watch that. There was also A Strange But True, the one with Michael Aspel from the 90s, that I think I can find on YouTube. Then there was the 2015 TV miniseries with Timothy Spall. And since then, there's been an Apple TV special, Enfield Haunting. I think it's just called The Enfield Haunting documentary. And apparently that's got some more recent interviews with the people involved.
Okay.
So I am looking forward to just lazing around in my pajamas, possibly eating some pizza, and having a good old binge on all of the Enfield documentaries that we can find. We will not be watching The Conjuring, though. I have seen it years ago. Not in any rush to repeat that, and really has no bearing on the actual Enfield haunting case at all.
No, and I'm definitely looking forward to this as well. And the other thing I'm interested in is, because it's been really quiet at Coffee HQ recently, spooky activity wise, and I'm interested to know if having like a paranormal weekend will spice things up, or if it will give them any ideas if watching.
It did get quite noisy here for not so long ago, and then it just kind of suddenly really went quiet, didn't it?
It's been really quiet.
Very odd. Well, we'll have to see if having a weekend-long Enfield binge stirs things up. And if anybody else wants to join in, we can always put a post in the Facebook group, so you can all pop in what you watch in there and let us know how you're getting on and what you think of all the various documentaries. I'm going to try and watch them in like chronological order, starting from the 70s and working my way towards present day, because I'm a bit of a nerd like that.
And I wouldn't have you any other way.
Well, that does bring us to the end of the listener stories for this episode. Thank you so much again to everybody who shared a story with us today.
But fear not, that is not the end of the episode, not by a long shot, because we've still got the paranormal postcard to come as we visit Mannington Hall in search of the Antiquary's ghost.
Our first paranormal postcard road trip since we waved a tearful goodbye to the Coffeemobile didn't exactly go smoothly. Not having the comforts of our trusty but rusty van pal, we didn't want to stray too far from our home county this time, so we headed to Norfolk, a place that we're quite familiar with. We know the roads fairly well and the facilities available along the route. But we left much later than intended, with over 2 hours of travel ahead, and I found it difficult to settle into adventure mode. I love my little car, but we'd never been on a road trip for the podcast without the Coffeemobile, and everything just felt a bit off, like I'd forgotten something important or I was woefully underprepared. But as the miles rolled by, and we transitioned from major roads to single-lane carriageways winding through patchwork fields, I started to get my travel legs back and ease into the idea of being out on a spooky adventure. We passed through pretty villages and by an isolated church standing adrift in a sea of farmland with no apparent parish. We drove through leafy, tree-tunnelled roads, further and further from civilization it seemed, until we finally reached a single-track road, where passing places were few and far between, and meeting oncoming traffic, who weren't at all inclined to wait their turn, involved sharp intakes of breath, a few choice muttered curse words, and an unexpected gratitude for being in a smaller car, which certainly gave me a different perspective on things. Our chosen route took us right up to the very gates of Mannington Hall, the grand tree-lined avenue picking up where the road came straight at it from the nearby village of Saxthorpe and running down to the west face of the manor. Back in the heyday of the hall, horse-drawn carriages would have clattered along this approach, passing under the dappled light of the lime tree avenue and emerging into the estate grounds, where the vista opened out into ornamental gardens framing a view of the moated hall. Not so for us peasants, though. The tree-lined avenue had wrought iron gates firmly closed across it, bearing the sign Private Drive. A shame, as I do love pretending that I'm riding a creaky carriage instead of my equally creaky car, but us visitors have to make do with parking up to the left of the grand entrance, in an admittedly free and spacious car park, and walking towards the visitor centre along the line of the drive, occasionally peeping through the bars of the fence. Between being late leaving, having to make a couple of stops on the way, fuel for the car and fuel for us, time was getting on when we arrived, and the lady at the reception desk queried if we really wanted to buy tickets at this time of day, doubting that we'd have time to get around the gardens and expansive walks around the estate. For a horrified moment, I thought she was about to refuse us entry, and that we would have driven all that way for nothing. But after assuring her that we'd whiz round like the wind, she relented. That was the plan, anyway, but since when did things go according to plan in the coffee universe?
Tickets in hand, we headed into the estate. Neat lawns rolled gently down towards the hall, punctuated by graceful, mature trees. On the left, a patio area was furnished with cheerfully painted tables and chairs, and just beyond, the old stable block, now converted into a tea room, bustled with drinks and cakes being ferried to visitors enjoying the shade of little canvas sun umbrellas. More picnic benches were placed around the stump of what was once a huge and girthy tree, standing sentinel on a circular patch of lawn that has been made into an island by the turning circle of the gravel drive. One moment I was breathing in the warm late summer day and planning where to explore first, and the next, the ground suddenly didn't exist anymore beneath the foot I had intended to place down, and the ground was rushing towards my face. This isn't the first time I've fallen and injured myself on a road trip. In fact, it happens frequently enough that we now have a sliding scale of injury based on location. How's the pain? Is it Whitby bad or Cresswell Crags bad? One of these days we're going to have to do a tour of all the locations I've been to but never seen because I've spent the visit nursing a busted knee, back or ankle. Fortunately, today it's definitely not Cresswell Crags bad, which would require actual first aid, and not even quite Whitby bad. But, bearing in mind we were already running late, a twisted ankle and bruised knees wasn't helpful for tearing around an estate at the whizzing pace we had just promised the ticket lady. Instead, I got to sample the caffeinated delights of the tea shop and found myself a picnic bench with a grand view of the west front of the hall to raise my hopefully not swelling ankle and soak up the atmosphere of this intriguing 15th century manor.
From Fitz's vantage point, the north end of the manor was obscured by a tall wall that encloses the west-facing garden. Built of red brick, the wall doesn't look particularly medieval in origin, but despite this, it boasts mock battlements along the top, and what look for all the world like arrow slits in its side. The wall ends in a tiny guardhouse that has the air of a tumble-down Victorian garden shed. Creeping vines spill over the top of the wall, and ivy bursts out of the glazed window. At the northwest corner of the wall, a sturdy buttress dips down into a shallow and not very defensive-looking moat, prettily and thickly filled with water lily pads that instantly bring to mind Monet. I rounded the wall to get a head-on glimpse of the hall itself, and found the architecture just as wonderfully eccentric and confused-looking as the mock battlemented wall. With an odd aesthetic I can't help but liken to that of a gawky adolescent castle that hasn't quite grown into its turrets yet, the grey and iron-stained flint building is also crenellated all along its length, ending in 2 polyagonal towers on the south side, topped with more battlements. Between this are arched Gothic windows and gargoyles leering down from the walls, a description which might bring to mind something of a castle, but behind those crenellations rises a sloped, pan-tiled roof graced with a collection of twisting motif chimneys. There are pretty herbaceous borders and hedges sculpted into obelisks framing the west door, which all speak to a dignified country pile, rather than something that was built to withstand attack, despite the protestations of the towers and the moat. For one thing, you walk down a slope to the manor, when any self-respecting castle would be built on a mound or hill. And as beautiful as the moat is, the sunlight glittering on the water in the late August sun, it's probably knee-deep and 2 strides across, so it's doubtful that it would stop any sword-wielding opponents in their tracks. Instead, it has a fairy tale air about it, partly from the juxtaposition of the cold grey crenellations against the warm red brick candy cane chimneys, and partly from the flourishing plants tumbling about everywhere, spilling out of borders, erupting over walls and cascading into the moat. I can picture a silk-berobed princess flitting across the perfectly striped lawns, or peering longingly out of one of the arched Gothic windows. I almost expect a knight on a white charger to whiz past me and go clopping across the quaint wrought-iron drawbridge. Some of the odd aesthetic is reportedly the result of renovations carried out in 1864 by Horatio Walpole, 4th Earl of Orford, a British peer and politician who inherited the hall on his father's death in 1858. The Earl had an interest in antiquity and Gothic architecture, and well he might. After all, his ancestor, another Horatio Walpole, and another Earl of Orford, was the author of The Castle of Otranto, a novel long lauded as being the very first Gothic novel, published in 1764. Our 19th century Earl of Orford, meanwhile, set his sights on Gothic architecture rather than Gothic literature, and renovated his inherited manor using bits and pieces from other family properties, whilst retaining many of the actual medieval parts of the building. The Lady magazine claimed it was nigh on impossible to tell which of the hall's gargoyles were original anymore, due to the number the eccentric Earl added. His eccentricities also shine through in some quite bizarre Latin inscriptions around the west doorway. Above the door reads Morituro Satis, which a Walpole relative has translated as meaning, "This house is sufficient for one who has not long to live." A little morbid perhaps, but nothing compared to the inscription on the left side of the door, which shouts to all and sundry just what the Earl thought of the women in his life. It translates to something along the lines of, "What is worse than a tigress? A demon. What is worse than a demon? A woman. What is worse than a woman? Nothing." Yikes! And you thought that today's passive-aggressive memes were bad. Imagine how angry you have to be to carve something like that into the actual walls of your house. I think eccentric is perhaps a rather polite description of our Earl. But this is only a fragment of Mannington's history. Look closer, and the telltale signs of its long and storied past are clear to see. The 3 rows of windows don't sit neatly at the same level on each floor. They jump about, a few of them seemingly hanging between floor levels. The west front bears the scar of a huge archway, now filled in, that once peaked just below the more recent first-floor windows and was about 3 times as wide as the current door. Within this space the archway would once have formed, one of a pair of smaller windows sits adrift, its twin outside the arch space on yet another different level, with a third ground floor window crammed in below them. I wonder what this face looked like originally. Was it a massive carriage entrance? A huge window? Surely it's far too big to have been the original door. But Mannington holds many mysteries and secrets, and so it should, having been around for 5.5 centuries. Unfortunately, whilst visitors to Mannington can explore the grounds to their heart's content, the hall itself is closed to the public, so we cannot roam its haunted hallways to search out those secrets for ourselves. In fact, there's not even a guidebook available for purchase to give us a glimpse within these storied walls. I peer longingly into the inscrutable, reflective eyes of the mullioned windows, but they don't give away any secrets.
Fortunately, though, a book published in 1894 titled Mannington and the Walpoles does dish up a few of the hall's secrets and describes for us a brief guided tour of the house as it was in the 19th century. The book, written by a relative of our eccentric 4th Earl of Orford, focuses on the typical things you would expect a 19th century author to detail when writing about a manor house, namely family history, building history, and some of the more precious antiques and paintings. And interestingly for us, it just so happens that a couple of paintings within Mannington's sturdy flint walls come with their own ghost stories. We encounter our first painting of interest hanging in Mannington's dining room. The author writes, "Entering the dining room, there is a curious old fireplace and stone mantelpiece carved with the arms of Lumner, the ancient possessors of the property. Near this mantelpiece stand 2 whole-length figures of a monk, apparently claimed by death, who takes the form of a skeleton, and is urging the unhappy monk to follow whither he listeth. On the other side of the room is a full-length picture of the ambassador Horace Walpole. Of course, the portrait of the skeletal monk and unhappy companion is tantalizingly macabre, but in fact our portrait of interest is the more mundane sounding of the two, the picture of Ambassador Horace Walpole. Really, this was yet another Horatio, and this Horatio had owned not only Mannington Hall, but also another manor house just a stone's throw away, called Wolterton Hall. Wolterton is only a mile east of Mannington as the crow flies, and the 2 estates more or less share a boundary line. The ambassador bought the Wolterton estate before he acquired Mannington, in order to be close to the nearby Houghton estate of his brother Robert Walpole, the man credited with being Britain's first Prime Minister. Both Houghton Hall and Wolterton became known as 2 of the 4 Whig powerhouses of Norfolk, alongside Holkham and Rainham Halls, due to the family's great influence in Parliament, an accolade not bestowed upon the smaller Mannington, which the ambassador purchased essentially to extend his Wolterton estate. Knowing all this, it's not really surprising to learn that the portrait of the ambassador hanging in the dining room of Mannington originally hung at the subject's neighbouring property of Wolterton Hall. But what is odd is that the painting is not really a complete portrait, as it appears to be. It was, in fact, cut out of a much larger group portrait depicting the ambassador's whole family, including his wife Mary Lombard and 7 or 8 children, some of whom were painted as angels due to their sad loss in infancy. Chopping up a painting like that sounds a little odd and rather destructive, but the author of Mannington and the Walpoles, Lady Dorothy Neville, was of the opinion that it was very cleverly done. Of course, she might have been a tad biased, as it was her own father who cut it up. Apparently, though, he did it in a way that made the paintings of each subject look as though they were complete portraits, and then he gifted these pictures to the subject's descendants. But it seems that not all the family members were as happy with the result, in particular Mary Lombard. In life, Mary had resided at Wolterton Hall with her husband Horace, or Horatio Walpole, and it seems that she was reluctant to leave there even after her death. The division of her family's portrait seemed to disturb her restless spirit, and after it was cut up and the pieces sent out to surviving relatives, her apparition was reported to have been seen flitting around Wolterton Hall. Rumours abounded that the ghostly figure was searching for the missing pieces of the portrait, and I have to wonder whether Mary Lombard ever made the short trip across the fields to Mannington, where a piece of her family picture graced the walls, and whether she was responsible for some of the strange phenomena that's been reported there over the centuries.
I wonder which window belongs to the dining room that housed the cut-up portrait as I amble down the west side of the house and round one of the flint towers to pass through an archway cut into the hedge. As I emerge onto the south lawn, the view reveals the second turret and a face of the house that is slowly being swallowed up by creeping greenery that has rambled inchingly upwards to poke viney fingers at the second-floor windows. The neatly clipped grass has cutaways filled with gravel that form a small knot garden at the centre, with potted roses and a bronze sundial. Facing away from the house, the lawn runs down to the moat, where lichen-encrusted, weather-softened stone busts gaze unblinkingly back towards the hall like silent guardians. I wonder at all the things they must have witnessed play out here over the years. In fact, though, according to our author, Lady Dorothy, these busts only appeared on Mannington's lawn in the 19th century, which is really just a recent blip on the timeline of this ancient house. Most records will tell you that the hall was built in the 15th century by a man named William Lumner. We know a little of it because of the details of its build are mentioned in an archive known as the Paston Letters, a fascinating collection of family correspondence spanning 3 centuries that gives a unique insight into medieval, Tudor and Stuart life. When Lumner built Mannington, England was on the cusp of the start of the Tudor era, which brought with it tremendous political and religious upheaval and instability. And I suppose this context does throw a slightly different light on those turrets, battlements and moat, for which a licence to fortify was sought and granted. It certainly puts them into a less fairy tale context. But in fact, Mannington's roots go even deeper than that, all the way back to an England that was still reeling from the Norman invasion, with the manor's first mention appearing in the Domesday Book of 1086, with its earlier name of Mantua. Of course, this far back, the history is sketchy and fragmented. We know that by 1291, it was in the ownership of Maud Turrell, who passed it down her family line into the eventual ownership of William Lumner, her great-great-grandson, and he built the bones of the hall we see today, on the site of what was, presumably, a more ancient manor house. After the Lumners came the Potts family, who held the estate from 1585 until the 18th century, and whose ancestral bones still lie beneath the soil of Mannington's grounds. But it was the Walpoles who seem to have brought the ghosts to Mannington after the estate was purchased by Ambassador Horace Walpole in 1736, who brought with him another painting connected to another ghost story. We are introduced to this painting via another of Lady Dorothy's virtual house tours. She writes, "We enter a small low hall hung with armour and deer's heads. The hall is hung, as well as the staircase, with fine old tapestry, and the story goes that the greater part of it was given by Cardinal Fleury to Ambassador Walpole. With this tapestry are also hung here and there some of the family portraits. The most conspicuous of these is that of the Venerable Henry Walpole. And, dear listeners, I'm sure you're all as relieved as me to find a Walpole who was not named Horatio."
Henry Walpole was the unfortunate protagonist of a rather grisly story that played out against the backdrop of religious persecution during the reign of Elizabeth I. At this time, England had been flip-flopping back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism since King Henry VIII broke from Rome and established the Church of England in 1534. Protestantism was established throughout the country during the next king's reign, but King Edward's rule was a short one, and after he died at the tender age of 15, there was a scrabble for the crown between named successor Lady Jane Grey, who was queen for only 9 days, and Edward's half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom ended up having a turn at the throne. Mary Tudor restored Catholicism during her reign and earned herself the nickname Bloody Mary from her brutal persecution of those who refused to give up their Protestant faith. Having wrested the crown from her half-sister's hands, it was then Elizabeth's turn, who switched the country back to Protestantism and put Catholics in the firing line instead. Henry Walpole was raised Catholic during Elizabeth's reign, a time when followers of the faith suffered unspeakable horrors for renouncing the religion of the crown. Henry saw this up close and personal when one of his close friends was horribly executed for his beliefs. So close and personal, in fact, that he came away with his clothes spattered in blood. This traumatizing experience only cemented his faith, though, and Henry determined to become a Jesuit priest, an occupation which would automatically make him guilty of treason. He left England for France and then on to Rome, and was eventually ordained in Paris. But as soon as he returned to England, he was arrested. He was held and tortured at the Tower of London, and after resolutely refusing to take the oath of supremacy, a vow to acknowledge the Queen's complete authority in religion, he met a grisly end at the hands of an executioner. As you can imagine, Henry's story was a well-known and much-remembered one amongst the Walpoles. But in 1879, someone outside the family became very interested in the man's story. Enter Augustus Jessup, cleric, teacher, writer, and a friend of Lord Orford's. Jessup became so interested in Henry Walpole that he decided to write a book on him, and began his meticulous and lengthy research. However, some of the information he desperately wanted to get his hands on was contained within the books of Lord Orford's library at Mannington Hall. So, when Orford invited Jessup to a dinner party in the October of 1879, Jessup jumped at the chance and sent his reply, asking if he could possibly spend a little time in the Hall's library after dinner. Lord Orford cordially agreed, and Jessup eagerly set about planning a nice long research session. But it did not quite go according to plan, because the writer's studies were interrupted in the small hours of the night by an apparition. We're fortunate enough to have a first-hand eyewitness account of what happened that night, because Jessup left us a signed statement dated just a month after his encounter. Presumably, he wanted to set it to paper while it was still fresh in his mind. Then, in the following January, his experience captivated a much wider audience when he published his account in the Athenaeum, Journal of Literature, Science and Fine Arts. As a precursor to the tale, he explained his reasons for publishing it. He had spoken to friends about what he had witnessed, and the story had quickly spread among friends and acquaintances, the fascinating tale becoming a favourite topic of conversation. And of course, we all know what happens when a story gets told and retold by word of mouth, as it becomes second-hand, then third-hand, then a friend of a friend who knows someone who, well, details get fuzzy, and it can, as they say, grow legs. It got to the point where Jessup felt tales of his encounter were beginning to accumulate additional and mythical elements, and that he, at the centre of it all, was in danger of becoming a hero of romance. He wanted neither to be viewed as some kind of medium, nor as one liable to fantastical delusions, so he submitted his account to the Athenaeum as precisely as possible, in order to set the record straight.
On the 10th of October, 1879, I drove over from Norwich to Mannington Hall to spend the night at Lord Orford's. We dined at 7. Our party numbered 6 persons. Of these, 4 at least had been great travellers. I myself was rather a listener. The talk was general and discursive, and amused and interested me greatly. Not for a single moment did it turn upon the supernatural. It was chiefly concerned with questions of art and the experiences of men who had seen a great deal of the world. I have rarely been at a more pleasant party. Thus Jessup began his account of his strange experience at Mannington, already anticipating the response of his readers, it seems, in his efforts to ensure no one was under the impression that anything strange or spooky had been the topic of conversation that could therefore have influenced his mood later on. And it certainly doesn't seem that Jessup had ghosts on his mind when he requested permission to retire to the library after dinner. It was quite clear that all he was thinking about was those rare books of Lord Orford's, and how much he could glean from them before dawn. The pair had a little back and forth over this, as Lord Orford wanted his valet to stay up until Jessup had finished his work, to ensure that all the lights were properly put out. Jessup, however, was mortified by the idea of the man having to stay up to wait for him, and knew that he would end up rushing his work so as not to inconvenience the poor fellow. He appealed to Lord Orford, promising that he would make sure everything was thoroughly in order before he went to bed, and eventually Orford acquiesced, much to Jessup's relief. Rightly or wrongly, I've always thought of Jessup as somewhat of a fellow nerd, partly due to his peers' comments about the level of toil he put into what they considered undeserving of such detailed research. A kindred spirit, then, if those claims have any substance. So I imagine him waiting with anticipation as everyone else slowly made their way to bed, gathering up his rare books, laying out his writing materials, and maybe giving a little contented sigh as he eased into the chair by the fire, sinking into the quiet hours of the night as the stillness of the house settled around him, the cease of the daylight hustle and bustle unravelling the deliciously undisturbed hours of darkness ahead. A time briefly unhindered by the marching schedule of the day, a suspended time in which us bookworms can allow ourselves to be entirely swallowed by our subject for a few fleeting but precious hours. He describes bringing his books from a high shelf of the inner library to the next room, where he placed them on a table lit by candles in 4 shiny silver candlesticks, where he positioned himself to soak up the heat from the roaring fire, being, by his own admission, someone of a chilly disposition. By 11 o'clock, he was the only person left downstairs, and he was, as he says, busily engaged reading and taking notes. And there he stayed, uninterrupted, until 1 a.m. The only sounds in the wood-panelled library, the gentle licking of flames in the fireplace, the crisp sound of turning pages, and the scratching of Jessop's pen. But he was about to have a very odd and unexpected interruption. And to honour Jessop's desire for his encounter to remain true to his experience and without embellishment, I'll let him tell you what happened, in his own words.
I had got on better than I expected, and I had only one more book to occupy me. I rose, wound up my watch, and opened a bottle of seltzer water, and I remember thinking to myself that I should get to bed by 2 after all. I set to work on the last little book. I had been engaged upon it about half an hour, and was just beginning to think that my work was drawing to a close, when, as I was actually writing, I saw a large white hand within a foot of my elbow. Turning my head, there sat a figure of a somewhat large man, with his back to the fire, bending slightly over the table, and apparently examining the pile of books that I had been at work upon. The man's face was turned away from me, but I saw his closely cut reddish-brown hair, his ear and shaved cheek, the eyebrow, the corner of the right eye, the side of the forehead, and the large high cheekbone. He was dressed in what I can only describe as a kind of ecclesiastical habit of thick corded silk or some such material, close up to the throat, and a narrow rim or edging of about an inch broad of satin or velvet serving as a stand-up collar and fitting close to the chin. The right hand, which had first subtracted my attention, was clasping, without any great pressure, the left hand. Both hands were in perfect repose, and the large blue veins of the right hand were conspicuous. I remember thinking that the hand was like the hand in Velázquez's magnificent Dead Knight in the National Gallery. I looked at my visitor for some seconds, and was perfectly sure that he was not a reality. 1,000 thoughts came crowding upon me, but not the least feeling of alarm or even uneasiness. Curiosity and a strong interest were uppermost. For an instant I felt eager to make a sketch of my friend, and I looked at a tray on my right for a pencil. Then I thought, upstairs I have a sketchbook. Shall I fetch it? There he sat, and I was fascinated, afraid not of his staying, but lest he should go. Stopping in my writing, I lifted my left hand from the paper, stretched it out to the pile of books, and moved the top one. I cannot explain why I did this. My arm passed in front of the figure, and it vanished. I was simply disappointed and nothing more. I went on with my writing as if nothing had happened, perhaps for another 5 minutes, and I had actually got to the last few words of what I had determined to extract, when the figure appeared again, exactly in the same place and attitude as before. I saw the hands close to my own. I turned my head again to examine him more closely, and I was framing a sentence to address to him when I discovered that I did not dare to speak. I was afraid of the sound of my own voice. There he sat, and there sat I. I turned my head again to my work, and finished writing the 2 or 3 words I still had to write. The paper and my notes are at this moment before me, and exhibit not the slightest tremor or nervousness. I could point out the words I was writing when the phantom came and when he disappeared. Having finished my task, I shut the book and threw it on the table. It made a slight noise as it fell. The figure vanished. Throwing myself back in my chair, I sat for some seconds looking at the fire with a curious mixture of feeling, and I remember wondering whether my friend would come again, and if he did, whether he would hide the fire from me. Then first there stole upon me a dread and a suspicion that I was beginning to lose my nerve. I remember yawning. Then I rose, lit my bedroom candle, took my books into the inner library, mounted the chair as before, and replaced 5 of the volumes. The 6th I brought back and laid upon the table where I had been writing when the phantom did me the honour to appear to me. By this time I had lost all sense of uneasiness. I blew out the 4 candles and marched off to bed, where I slept the sleep of the just, or the guilty, I know not which, but I slept very soundly. This is a simple and unvarnished narrative of facts. Explanation, theory, or inference I leave to others.
From this account, Jessup comes across as a curious and open-minded witness, and I think we have this disposition to thank for both the reappearance of the apparition and the amount of detail that Jessup was able to recall for us. If the writer's first instinct had been one of terror rather than intrigue, no doubt he would have fled the library, and the sighting would have only been a scant glance. As it was, however, Jessup got a good enough look at the features and clothing of the mysterious phantom to suspect that he might have actually seen the ghost of Lord Orford's ancestor, Henry Walpole, the very subject of the book Jessup had been, at that moment, researching. Now, when Jessup related this experience to his friends, and indeed to Lord Orford, his linking the sighting to Henry Walpole made them rather sceptical. His ability to recognise the features of the ghost was partly because a portrait of the doomed priest hung at Mannington Hall, but some considered that seeing his image on the wall there, alongside Jessup's intense study of the man and the Walpole priest's rather morbid story, mixed together with a late night in a draughty and ancient manner, all combined to put Jessup in a state of mind where his fatigue-bleared vision invited him to see something that fitted his particular interests in that moment. Another sticking point for his peers was that Henry Walpole had never lived at Mannington Hall, him being from a much earlier lineage than the Walpoles who had first bought the estate, so they didn't see any reason that he would be haunting the place. This might at first glance seem like a logical conclusion, but in our experience, nothing about the paranormal is logical. And who's to say that the spirit of the ancestral Walpole wasn't attached to his portrait that hung at Mannington, rather than the place itself? Or even that Jessup's intense study of his life from the family books hadn't somehow manifested the ghost in the library? The truth is that none of us actually have any idea how any of this works. But not everyone was as sceptical. Many were simply fascinated. After all, ghost stories, spiritualism, and the afterlife were hugely popular subjects of interest during this period of history, so it's not surprising that Jessup's encounter did the 19th century equivalent of going viral. Now, if you're thinking that you may have heard Jessup's name before, you would be correct. He has popped up on this very show in a previous episode on phantom coaches, when we discussed his connection to scholar and ghost story legend M.R. James. The two men came together to work on publishing a 12th century Latin manuscript that James had found, titled The Life and Miracles of St. William of Norwich by Thomas of Monmouth. Jessup and James found they got on well and became good friends. Presumably, it didn't hurt that in addition to their scholarly interest in history, they also shared a fascination with the supernatural. M.R. James is lauded as the father of folk horror and inventor of the Antiquarian ghost story. But there are some who think one of James's most famous stories, A Warning to the Curious, was inspired by an article titled Hill Digging and Magic, published in the British literary journal The 19th Century in 1887, and written by his good friend Augustus Jessup. Not only that, but Jessup's account of his ghostly experience at Mannington was published by the Athenaeum under the title of An Antiquary's Ghost Story, a good 24 years before James's stories were published in the volume Ghost Stories of an Antiquary in 1904. The irony was that Jessup reportedly hated the title that the Athenaeum had given his article, claiming that he was no antiquary. Antiquary or not, though, the story struck a chord with the journal's audience, and stacks of letters were received from those who had burning questions about the apparition, and plenty of their own theories about what had happened. And just like today, there appeared to be camps of firm skeptics, firm believers, and those still on the fence.
Some thought he must have fallen asleep over his books, or that he had perhaps consumed rather more alcohol than he was letting on. An interesting aside is that in Jessup's original statement, the drink he got up to fetch shortly before his encounter was noted as whiskey and water, but in the Athenaeum account, the alcoholic part of that beverage had mysteriously disappeared. People questioned whether he was sitting opposite a mirror when he saw the figure, or wondered whether the servant had really gone to bed after all. Others wanted to know if the ghost had sat in a real chair, whether it had made rustling noises, or even what Jessup had eaten for dinner. One of the more fascinating theories for what he saw is detailed in a letter held by the Norfolk Records Office, in which the author of a letter refers to a theory born of a time when the biological functions of the human eye were still being explored. A theory that images could become imprinted upon the retina of the eye. The idea is reminiscent of how old computer screens could end up with ghostly imprints of static images burned into them after having been left on the display for too long. If you're old enough to remember screensavers, you know what I'm talking about. The author of the letter wrote to Jessup asking, "Did the figure bear any resemblance to anyone whom you know and might have lately seen, and whose appearance was unconsciously imprinted upon the retina, and some shadow thrown on or object being upon the table assumed the form of that person?" A few years after this letter was sent, police tried to use this same theoretical technique to catch the serial killer Jack the Ripper. They took close-range photos of his victims' eyes in the hope that the perpetrator's image would be imprinted on the retinas of those murdered and lead them to the killer. Of course, this didn't help them catch the Ripper, and it wouldn't have explained away Jessup's ghost either. One theory that must stop to give us pause, though, comes from an account also held at the Norfolk Records Office, written by Lord Orford's steward, who was one of only 2 male servants on duty at Mannington Hall on the night of Jessup's ghostly encounter. The steward claims that Jessup's ghost was none other than the valet on duty that night, a large Italian man by the name of Carlo. The steward stated that Carlo had snuck into the library, where he found that Jessup had dozed off. Seeing an opportunity for a midnight tipple at his employer's expense, Carlo apparently tried to swipe the brandy decanter from under the doctor's sleeping nose. But Jessup woke up before he could do so, and according to the report, the writer then tried to stab the interloper's hand with his pen. Mystery solved? Well, it doesn't seem to fit well with Jessup's quite detailed description of what happened. He may have deliberately neglected to include the whiskey he added to his seltzer water, but does this omission cast enough doubt on his recollection of events to take the steward's word instead of his? Jessup describes actually being in the process of taking notes at the time of the sighting, and even states that he can point out the exact words he was writing at the points the phantom appeared and disappeared. And then there is the level of detail he describes, including the table at which he sat, with 4 shiny silver candlesticks, candles lit and burning brightly. But nowhere did he mention there being a decanter of brandy on the table, and in fact describes rising from the table to get a drink. The details Jessup noticed about the man's features, clothing, the calm repose of his hands, one clasping the other, don't seem to describe anything like a servant making a grab for a brandy decanter, and I'm not sure that Jessup's measured consideration of whether he could go and get a sketchbook to record the apparition sounds like a man startled from sleep and making a jab at a pilfering valet with his pen. I wonder also whether Jessup wouldn't rather easily have been able to tell the difference between a servant's livery and the ecclesiastical habit of thick corded silk that he describes the apparition as wearing. And, of course, as we heard at the beginning of the story, all the servants, everybody else in the house in fact, were supposedly in bed at the time of the apparition's appearance. Could Lord Orford have asked the valet to stay up after all? Possibly. But if he did, then he didn't mention the fact to Jessup, even after Jessup had told him about his encounter. If nothing else, you would think Lord Orford might have recognised his own valet from Jessup's description, had it been the servant that Jessup mistook for a ghost. So, we have 2 different stories about what happened, and only the eyewitness testimony of both parties, with no way of ever validating either of them. Would Jessup have risked his reputation by publishing his account so publicly? But then again, would the steward have ratted out the brandy-sneaking valet? And if so, to what end? For what it's worth, other than missing out the whiskey part of his whiskey and water in the journal publication, not one other detail changed in Jessup's account over the years, even when he published it amongst a collection of other ghost stories called Frivola in 1896. And, as we heard from his statement in the Athenaeum, he did not wish to be considered any kind of a paranormal expert. He certainly seems to have had a believer in the author of our Guide to Mannington Hall, Lady Dorothy Walpole, as she mentions the encounter of her learned and accomplished friend Dr. Jessup, both in her book Mannington and the Walpoles and in her autobiography. And both these books have a little more light to shed on some more of Mannington's mysteries. But to uncover these, we must leave the house and go in search of Mannington's ruined parish church, where rumours abound of a tormented spirit doomed to haunt their burial place.
To find the church, I have to leave the immediate grounds of the house. Being entirely cut off by the surrounding moat, there is only one way out, so I pass by the overgrown scented garden, currently closed for nesting birds, back through the hedge to the west front, and cross the cast iron drawbridge, brushing past pink stands of valerian swaying gently in the breeze. I take a left, where the gravel drive foregoes the grand tree-lined avenue to make a shorter exit at the south side with easier access to the road. Crossing this narrow road, I start walking back up the hill a short way, under the shade of tremendous oak trees that pelt me with unripe acorns. After a short distance, I come across a sign on my left that invites me to leave the road through a small iron gate hung with a sign that tells me I have arrived at the chapel gardens. I enter an ornamental woodland and almost immediately come to a crossroads. On my left, the sandy bank dips down a steepish slope to a path that meanders off up ahead. On my right, the track follows the curve of a ridge. There is a conspicuous absence of any signage. I choose left. It was not the correct choice. Technically, the paths form a circuit, so there shouldn't really be a right or wrong choice. But me, being me, a person never blessed with any sense of direction, I somehow managed to find a secret third and definitely wrong choice. At least it was wrong if you were pushed for time like I was and didn't want to find yourself lost in a tunnel of laurel leading to nowhere. Having wasted as much time as possible with this endeavour, I backtracked, cut across the circuit through holly and brambles, and finally found some ruins. The first ruins I found, though, weren't part of the church. The chapel gardens are dotted with fragments of medieval masonry serving as follies. This woodland was curated in the late 19th century for scenic Victorian perambulations by one or other of the Horatios. There are 7 in total, and at this point I've given up trying to keep track. 2 of the follies are 15th century archways. One is placed on the approach to the site of the church from one direction, and the other across the path of the opposite approach. The placement has the effect of making one feel a little Narnia-ish stepping through, as though to access the church one has to enter a slightly different realm, a place out of time that only exists between the 2 doorways. I passed through the huge arched gateway that arose out of the woodland as though the great buttresses must split and twine into anchoring roots where they reached below the soil, the pale stone oddly at one with the multitude shades of green around it, and I felt a change in the air and a calm hush descend around me as I got my first glimpse of the ruins. The church wasn't something Walpole needed to add in to complete his Gothic fantasy garden. It had been here long before Mannington Hall was even a twinkle in an architect's eye. But complete it did, with a perfect aesthetic flourish. Old Horatio could never have fabricated a better Gothic garden feature than the authentically ruinous ancient church of St Mary's. The origins of the church are thought to be late Saxon, predating William Lumner's Hall by several centuries. In fact, there is evidence of even earlier Saxon activity southwest of the church, activity which intensified into the later Saxon period and grew into a flourishing medieval settlement. As villages go, though, it did not stand the test of time. Even by the 15th century, when Lumner's Mannington was built, the population was seriously dwindling, and by 1565 the village had all but disappeared, leaving St Mary's Church without a parish. It would be easy to say the small church was slowly being reclaimed by nature, but I think the time for that is long past, and it's more a case of modern-day gardeners waging a constant battle to retrieve the picturesque ruins from a generations-long reclamation by nature. Many plants have made homes in the ancient mortar that somehow still holds together the round flint nodules forming the walls of the small rectangular building. The roof is nothing but a distant memory, and grasses, tall fireweed and brambles sprout from the gables like green tresses. An area of grass is kept mown short all around the walls of the church, but what's left of the churchyard has been allowed to be slightly swallowed by nettles, whose vicious sting keeps grave markers and vaults reasonably safe from the attentions of any overly enthusiastic or less respectful visitors. The door to the church is boarded up, with a warning notice stating "Do not enter" due to structural instability, but it's possible to peek inside through an empty window. I was expecting just an empty shell, but in fact, a stone tomb stands at the centre of the small space on squat, columned feet. Part of a broken coffin rests against one wall, and a remarkably intact and sturdy round stone font sits near the entrance. Despite the ivy-creeped Gothic arches and forlornly leaning tombstones, the little church doesn't feel spooky at all. It feels atmospheric, certainly, with a kind of quietude that makes you suddenly able to really hear the sighing of the trees, the chirruping of the birds, and imagine that you can interpret every subtle gust of wind like a whispered message of divination. But what of the storied ghost, doomed to forever haunt her desecrated grave? Well, after a bit of digging, it turns out that some people are getting confused with a different Walpole ghost, one from their other property, Walterton Hall, just a mile across the fields, and with its very own abandoned and ruined medieval church in the grounds, making for an understandable confusion. At that ruined church, there was for some years a belief that the family had disturbed the slumber of some poor soul by moving her grave and causing her to haunt the family.
It's become a rather convoluted story, and no wonder, because it had already become muddled back in the 1800s when Lady Dorothy Nevill learned of it. Those of you with keen ears may recognise this name from earlier. Lady Dorothy was the author who wrote our guided tour of Mannington and its paintings. Before she married, she was another Walpole, and she wrote another book that now becomes pertinent to our story, her autobiography. And by all accounts, the good Lady D was quite a character. She was apparently a woman of voracious and ever-evolving interests, noted as a hostess, horticulturalist, and eccentric hobbyist. Author Virginia Woolf wrote of her, "Now she illuminated leaves which had been macerated to skeletons. Now she interested herself in improving the breed of donkeys. Next she took up the cause of silkworms, almost threatened Australia with a plague of them, and actually succeeded in obtaining enough silk to make a dress. Again, she was the first to discover that wood gone green with decay can be made, at some expense, into little boxes. She went into the question of funguses and established the virtues of the neglected English truffle. She imported rare fish, spent a great deal of energy in vainly trying to induce storks and Cornish choughs to breed in Sussex, painted on china, emblazoned heraldic arms, and, attaching whistles to the tails of pigeons, produced wonderful effects, as of an aerial orchestra when they flew through the air. I feel quite tired just reading about all her exploits, not to mention sorry for those poor pigeons. But that was just a taster. She also travelled extensively, grew rare plants for Charles Darwin's research, got into a little bit of a scandal with an MP, and amassed a vast circle of interesting friends. According to a review of her memoir by the Spectator magazine, which declared, "She has known almost everyone who was worth knowing during every epoch of her life." Her memoir, The Reminiscences of Lady Dorothy Nevill, certainly does make for some fascinating reading, and in the first chapter we discover one reason that may have added to her interest in the paranormal. Page 2 of the book begins. I received the name Dorothy after that unfortunate lady Dorothy Townsend, who is still supposed to haunt Raynham. The poor thing was the sister of Sir Robert Walpole, and the wife of the first Viscount Townsend, whose principal claim to remembrance is that he first introduced turnips from Germany into the county of Norfolk. She is referring, of course, to the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall, one of the most famous ghost photographs of all time, and family ghost of the Walpole's Norfolk neighbours, the Townsends, which is a fascinating case, but one for a whole other episode. We don't have to search much further through the autobiography, however, before we find the Walpole's own family ghost, and she, it turns out, is a harbinger of doom. It's actually not clear which or how many of the Walpole's properties she's seen in, but she does not seem to be limited to the ruined church. She was certainly known at Mannington Hall, as servants reported her flitting about the place, but she was most famous for appearing whenever some calamity was about to befall the family. Lady Dorothy recalls that the White Lady appeared to her brother. This is the same brother that lived at Mannington Hall, but she does not clarify whether he saw her at Mannington or Walterton. He obviously knew the legend as well as anyone, though, and understood from her appearance that some tragedy was about to occur, and he suspected that he would be at the centre of it. He said to his sister, "Is it you or I this time, Dolly? For we are the only ones left." Shortly after the sighting, Dorothy's brother passed away. So what is the connection to the churchyard? Our author enlightens us in her book Mannington and the Walpoles. I must relate a curious legend of the family belonging to Walterton and the old parish church there, now destroyed. Horatio, 2nd Earl of Orford, most sacrilegiously unearthed all the old tombstones belonging to the Scarmers, former possessors of this place, and sold them in Norwich, and one of the unhappy ladies of the family, never finding rest after so terrible a sacrilege, is still said to haunt the churchyard, always searching for the remains of her relations. Lady Dorothy mentions this tale again in her later autobiography, but this time only mentions the White Lady appearing as a crisis apparition. Quite how the phantom made the leap from haunting the churchyard to haunting the family homes is not explained, or in fact whether they are even the same spirit at all. But the Walpoles took the ghost seriously enough that they had a curious tradition to try and appease the spirit. Whenever a member of the family died, they made a slight detour on the way to the family vault to visit the ruined church. Here the hearse was driven 3 times around the ruined Walterton Chapel before going on to the final resting place. An odd ceremony that presumably was supposed to keep the spirit at bay. It turns out, though, that Lady Dorothy discovered in her later years that none of the Scarmer family tombstones were ever actually disturbed by the Walpoles, so she was at a loss as to why the White Lady haunted the family for generations. I wonder whether she continues to appear, or whether her last visitation was to warn Dorothy's brother, Lord Orford, that his time was nigh. St. Mary's Church in Mannington, though, seems to have remained free from supernatural forces. The spookiest occurrence there being an incident in the 18th century that must have felt rather portentous to the assembled onlookers, when 3 oak trees were suddenly swallowed up by the ground. A record named as the Philosophical Transactions describes how one late July day in 1717, to the astonishment of those present, an oak tree was seen to subside and sink into the earth, followed not long after by another 2 oak trees that were plunged into a 30-foot-wide bubbling hole. As ominous as it sounds, it did have a perfectly earthly cause. The gravelly soil had quicksand underneath it that was fed by springs around the estate, but it must have been a bizarre thing to witness. This appears to be the extent of the weird happenings at the little ruined church, although I suspect that if anyone at all is haunting it, it would likely be Lady Dorothy's brother, Lord Orford. He put so much of himself into Mannington, from the renovations of the hall to the ornamental woodland. He may actually still be here, right inside the ruined chapel, in fact. In Mannington and the Walpoles, Lady Dorothy describes the small parish church, detailing the lack of bell or steeple, and the contemporary lack of roof, and reports, "It is here, in the middle of this edifice, that my brother has prematurely elected to build his own tomb. Are Lord Orford's remains enshrined in the ruined church?" She promises to elaborate further on in the book, but doesn't enlighten us with much more detail, other than that Lord Orford had chosen to convert the ruined chapel into a mausoleum for himself. I very much wish that I'd discovered this information before our trip, as we could have looked for the tomb, which Orford's sister describes as granite, with the inscription "Hic jacet Horatius comes de Orford, mortis memor, posteriatis neglentium providens, hoc sepulchrum vivans sibi fecit." Roughly translated, and sadly my schoolboy Latin has long since left my mind, this translates to something like, "Here lies Horace, Earl of Orford, mindful of death, and providing for the negligence of posterity, he made this tomb for himself while living." We may be missing something crucial in translation, but if not, it's a rather strange epitaph. The sentiment seems at odds with the beauty and tranquillity of the little clearing in the woods, something I feel Lady Dorothy agrees with. She describes the glade as reposeful and full of sweet memories, where one may linger and always feel enjoyment. A delightful spot for dreamers and philosophers. Sweet nature reigns everywhere. I couldn't have put it better myself, Lady D.
As the wind shushes through the trees and ruffles the nettles guarding the gravestones, it's time for me to leave. I could have lingered much longer, soaking up the atmosphere and listening for any whispered memories bleeding through from Mannington's earlier lives, but closing time is approaching. I leave the glade, careful to exit through the other 15th century gateway, just to ensure I emerge back into my own time and plane of existence, and follow the wooded, meandering path through the ornamental woodland, back to the road lined with great oak trees, receiving another hail of acorns as I pass under them. I re-enter the grounds by the gravel drive, and try to gaze into those enigmatic, glinting windows one last time as I pass by the hall on my way to pick up Fitz. Most visitors have left for the day now. The bustle of the tea room has wound down to a gentle hum. But as the day creeps towards dusk, I feel that Mannington is just beginning to wake up. Oh, how I would love to get a peek inside those wood-panelled rooms when the sun has set and darkness gives life to the ancient manor's shadowy corners. What eyes would glint from the darkness? What figures would be seen flitting behind those mullioned panes? Do the ghosts of Mannington still glide about the halls? Well, in 1964, Anglia TV broadcast a documentary called The Unknown, which delved into the spooks that frequented certain ancient country piles, including Mannington Hall. For the programme, the presenters interviewed the then resident of Mannington, a Mr. Simon Carter, who, the viewers are told, had lived in the house for many years. Having related the strange tale of Dr. Jessop's ghost, the presenter asks Mr. Carter what he thinks of the encounter. Mr. Carter is somewhat dismissive. Jessop's theory, I think, is based on what he reported he saw in the dining room of a Jesuit priest who was hung, drawn and quartered in Elizabeth's reign. Jessop had made a historical study of this man and later wrote an article on him, and what I think he saw was an association of ideas produced also by the atmosphere in which he was working. The interviewer asks, "Has anyone else seen this particular ghost here?" Carter replies quickly and in the manner of someone who has just been validated. No, and I think that's what rather confirms my theory on this. A little crestfallen, the interviewer asks, hopefully, has there been any other phenomena here? Without missing a beat, Carter replies in a deadpan tone that completely belies the bombshell he is about to drop. Certainly. We've had a room at the top of the stairs that has a mild form of poltergeist in it. This was exorcised in 1912 and walled up for about 50 years. Ever professional, the Anglia TV presenter barely falters and probes for more recent experiences. Carter, still poker-faced, replies that his wife has experienced an inexplicable current of wind that rushes about the room, the light turning itself on and off, the door and casement window flinging themselves open. But apart from that, he says, with unwavering composure, nothing more alarming than that. Apparently, it takes more than a mild form of poltergeist to rattle a country gent. No wonder Jessop was so excited about his encounter with the Antiquary's ghost.
And that brings us to the end of today's Paranormal Postcard, and indeed to the end of our 9th HallowBirthday episode. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for your incredible support over the last nearly decade. We couldn't have done it without you. Thank you again to everyone who shared their stories with us this episode. And if you have a story to share, we would absolutely love to hear from you. Please do get in touch with us over on our website at knockOncevs.com. We hope that you'll join us next episode for some more spooky adventures. But until then, take care everyone, and
Happy Halloween!
If I pay for